Therese, you were speaking a while ago about growing up in Switzerland in an environment that you might say, almost say, predisposed you to becoming an artist. But I wonder if you just describe a little bit more about that part of your life, and since, let us say, you were predisposed to become an artist, just how you understood that at the beginning.
If I reflect on, what were some of the really relevant experiences that made me focus on the idea of possibly becoming an artist, it goes back very far. One of the things I remember is my parents had a subscription to a publication called Do, D-U spelling, that exists to this day. It's a cultural publication. It was beautifully put together, excellent images of artworks, good texts by art historians, philosophers, and so on. And it arrived predictably once a month, and I would have been 10 years old or so, where I was waiting for this appearance. I would take it away, run, hide, study this forever, and so on, take it in. And I became aware later, when I started to go to museums, visit museums, that I had seen these images. They were already part of my visual memory, very relevant. Another thing I remember, in a similar way, was a publication, a book form, that had a title something like Artists in Their Studios, and it showed some very interesting images by excellent photographers that showed particularly early modernist artists in their studios. And what struck me at the time was the fact that they were shown in an environment that didn't make any distinction between studio and living space, that this was continuous. And to me that was a revelation, the idea that somebody wouldn't live somewhere and go off to work, but that this was a complete environment. And of course I sensed that there was a lot of activity, mental activity was reflected in the way things looked. They looked very often messy. I was attracted by the grittiness of these images. I thought that was fantastic, a kind of a sense that there was an intellectual engagement that was palpable in the surroundings. So this is one thing I remember, looking at this and asking questions and so on. And then a little bit later, something that stands out for me also is, or were two interviews actually which I heard on TV. One was by Joseph Beuys, the other one by Jean Tinguely. And I'm not sure anymore. I was trying to remember whether the Beuys thing was in conjunction with the When Attitudes Become Form. And in each case, these people represented something, an intensity of engagement and the urgency in the way they presented the ideas that stayed with me, and I was absolutely convinced. I mean, neither of them at that point had already very established careers. Those were early moments in their careers, but I was absolutely convinced we would hear from these people in the future, that they had something to say that was very convincing. And aside from those vignettes, so to speak, I can of course think of just generally the Swiss landscape, cultural landscape, of having provided a lot of input. Excellent museums, good collections, a lot of discussion about culture, and so on. So I think that was all something that promoted my idea that I wanted to be one of those people who contributed to that reality, that world.
When you had that thought, and the thought of contributing to that world, did you have a thought about what kind of contribution you could offer? I suppose more generally speaking, given the background that you're describing, were you developing thoughts about what an artist can do or what an artist does, and how you could contribute to that?
Well, one thing, my expectation was it would be something very difficult. I didn't see it as something glamorous, or I was not attracted by the idea that very often this plays out in a public environment. It was more the idea of thinking about the realities of the world intensely and in an ongoing way. That was sort of at the center of my perception of what that meant. And I thought, well, it also is probably necessary to be outside any kind of mainstream, and that attracted me, to think it means finding your own way, your own position in relationship to what takes place in the world as a whole. But I didn't think career in the sense of, being successful, nothing like it. It was the activity, the process of reflecting on reality of the state of the world.
So this is, what you're describing then, is a world of ideas.
Yes, very much so, very much so.
And was there anything specific that fed those ideas? You're developing ideas at the time, or was it a general process of reading across ideas?
Both, reading across ideas, particularly, this is something that I continue to identify as an attractive dimensional characteristic of art making, to look at many disciplines and see links and differences, to look at obviously art history, but that meant also history in a larger sense, to look at scientific constructs or scientific research, to look at philosophical constructs, to look at ideological constructs, to look at political structures, that I could realize they were all linked, that within artworks there were concerns that were not necessarily so narrowly separating everything else out, although of course there would be a focus on specific things in specific works, but in general it would be trying to compare and analyze the relationship of every aspect that makes our world what we think it is, or speculate it is.
I'm going to leap ahead and come back to something. You just mentioned art history as an interest, Therese. Do you want to expand on what part of art history you would have been interested in, and what part of art history you're interested in now, for that matter? What stream, perhaps?
Yeah, I was interested in looking at art history, looking at works in the context of art history when I was a student. And then I became more concerned with what the present meant in terms of art production. But as the years went by, I returned more to looking at work in a larger temporal context. And so I've looked at art history more, thinking, of course, it gives us clues and insights into the context or conditions under which certain works have come into existence. And no doubt the fact that I'm living with Arturo, who is an art historian as much as an artist, has promoted that also, that we have had many discussions on works of art from an art historical perspective. So I think it is possible, of course, to look at works very strictly in art historical terms. I think it is one basis, one perspective from which to analyze the content of works, but not necessarily the only one, but one that certainly I'm aware of and interested in. And I think if one wants to look at any work with some depth and complexity, art historical issues come into the discussion.
Perhaps I want to come back to this question of the history of ideas, it's a grand project you were describing earlier. This looking at the history of ideas is. I wonder if did you find yourself being attracted to one or other part of the history that you were looking through? Something specific in the history ideas that stood out for you?
History or art history?
History of ideas, well, it could be either art history or the history
Mhm.
of ideas around art, or it could be history of ideas more
Generally.
philosophically speaking. Is there something that stood out for you?
Well, of course, I was steeped in modernist ideas in my education, and it was present everywhere in the institutional environment I was studying in. So that shaped many of my thoughts and continue to be a point of reference for subsequent moments in my art production. And of course, with modernism, come particular ideas, certain thought patterns, certain philosophical constructs, certain theoretical constructs. Of course, also the 60s promoted specific attitudes. As students, we were enthusiastic about philosophers like Sartre, or of course we looked at other French philosophers, we looked at German philosophers. So that stayed very much as a point of reference into the present, I would say. So figures like Walter Benjamin, for instance, that was very relevant, when one thinks in terms of a cultural history, very relevant. Of course, his analysis also of the relationship between artworks and an audience, those things came into a discussion at that time.
It's been suggested that Kant was of great interest to you, thinking of modernity and the modern project. Was it Kant's ideas around concept and object that?
Yes.
Do you want to explore that?
Well, I was especially interested when I was producing a series of works on paper called Interior Schema, was the title. So the construct of a schema was of great interest to me, the notion of a model. That paired with a notion of a relationship between interior and exterior entities. In other words, an interior thought process paired with an observation of the outside world and how they would affect each other. And of course, in Kant's case too, aspects of his thinking that led towards moral or ethical concern, which I think also of being very central in the production of art, that in the end, I think artworks are the carriers of moral or ethical codes or concerns. And of course, he exemplified that very much in his writing. And of course, there are many other examples, but for me, that was of interest.
Bring this all together somehow, if that's possible, Therese, and I apologize if it's not, but bring this all together somehow, as you reflect on your years of practice. Would you say there's a fundamental purpose or fundamental core idea, something that becomes a leitmotif across the practice that you could articulate?
Well, I think in many general ways, I'm not unique in some of the core ideas that have run through many distinct bodies of work. And that is to, in essence, trying to construct a model or a reflection of the reality within which we live, and to do that in relationship to a number of points of reference, which I'm coming back to, what we touched on earlier, historic, philosophical, scientific, not so much religious in my case, but I see that as a very relevant part in other works, theoretical, ideological constructs, and to find a way to situate a position which keeps in mind all those entities which we as humans have constructed collectively to navigate through the world. And so, of course, at certain times, specific things have come more into focus, others have receded a little bit, but we continue, of course, as humans, to look to those points of references continuously, and it's ever shifting. So to make an image of this reality at a certain time in a certain place. And of course, what we do when we make artworks, we somehow reconcile what we know with what we do not know, which is more speculative. So what we know, of course, is a history which we are starting to recognize as we move through time, as being not necessarily only an individual history, but the collective history or a cultural history, all dictated by geography, cultural boundaries and so on. And to pair that with images which we have already received through art history by other artists who have been able to articulate such an image or a model, I could call it, and then to add to that something that reflects our time or something that points towards the future, so that what we perceive to be specific, our specific concerns at that moment, our fears and aspirations and celebrations at that moment in a certain place. And of course, that's how the work becomes individually distinct, that we recognize the things which are specific to that moment and to that place. So we are talking, of course, a little bit about Canadian history also now in the context of this project. It is part of writing a history, looking at this moment. What does it mean? Where are we in relationship to the 50 years previously, which was also such a moment, and then perhaps 100 years, back, and then perhaps all the way to from the moment where we have a recorded history, to look at these segments, at these moments where we pause and look,
I'd like to hear your thoughts on a work called Four Echoes. And I'll give you a small quote from yourself. I have constructed these pieces to juxtapose language with fragments of images. They are not full-fledged images, they are elements referencing forms in the original pieces. I am reconstructing them just enough to bring back a memory at the threshold of the perceptible. Do you want to explore that quote for me a little bit?
This is really referencing two bodies of work, but the one which is described more in this quote. And this is a series of works on paper, which is actually untitled. It's really under the heading of Untitled Series. And the way I've constructed it is that each of the works references a distinct body of work or an individual piece by an artist whose work I have followed over extended periods of time. Which brings us back to the whole idea of finding ways to position oneself, one's own work in relationship to things which we have acknowledged in our development, or I have developed in my development. So there were essentially four artists, and each of them produced work which resonated with me in a particular way. So the title was not only untitled, but in brackets, the first name of the artist. So as a first issue, I was interested in identifying these works. The second issue was to think in terms of what a titling process represented over time, because of course when we look at art history again, we see moments where titles had a different function, a different relationship to the work than at other moments in time. And the whole idea of not titling work, to me, was a very interesting moment. And we know, you know, the periods in the 20th century where many artists chose very deliberately to call the works not titled, the title not titled or untitled. And I wanted to comment on that not titling a work would in a way put another relationship into place between the viewer and the object in question. And I was aware recently of an artist in Switzerland who called the whole exhibition WOT in German, wieder ohne title, again without a title, which I thought was a wonderful construct, because of course he was referring to the history of titling works, not titling them again, and then back as a cyclical occurrence when we look at art history and the meanings or absence of meaning in this case. So I undermined the idea of untitled by placing the first, which is of course a familiar way of looking at or acknowledging or addressing that person, and at the same time also introducing the title of the body of work which I was referring to inside the work. So in each piece there was a grid structure. The grid structure, of course, an underlying very fundamental construct. Within that were placed very subtle elements which would reference one element of the work or body of work that I was addressing by the artist I was acknowledging. So just little fragments that would recall to anyone who was aware of that work what the source was. And then the title of the piece, the original work, incised inside the construct of an untitled work. So I wanted to have a layer of meanings coming together collectively. So the public and the private spheres were crossing. The idea of giving the work the name untitled, but including an actual title, playing those two approaches together, allowing them to resonate, and then of course the series of works which in turn were communicating with each other. So when I say that certain things were at the threshold of the visible, that was actually also a physical way of making the elements which were part of the original work less overt, but rather understated, bringing them or keeping them at the threshold of the perceptible, and allowing the viewer to have more of a personal response to the work. Yeah.
I'm reminded of a very familiar, definition, you might even say, of modern art and contemporary art, contemporary modern practices, the contemporary world we work in as artists, and that is that our business is to represent the unrepresentable. Given that, I just wonder if you could say a few words about the work that we have here in the studio behind you. I understand it's the reception series. I'm interested by somebody else who has characterized your work as exploring the essence of form, consistently evoking shapes that lie beyond the world of objects. And would you like to say just a few words about this piece?
Well, again, there are many layers. The first concern for me was to look at work that had not been received in a way that we assume is usually the case, but that that process was lying outside those patterns. And I've chosen a number of figures who for me represented that unusual development in the way audiences have responded to the work. So in this case of the work we have behind us, it is Robert Walser. And Robert Walser was a Swiss writer who died in 1956, whose work was highly acknowledged earlier in his career. He wrote novels, short texts and so on, which were published in book form or in newspapers. Clearly received, the work was known by major literary figures and so on, and at one point he was institutionalized for health reasons. And he continued to write, but the writing was in a tiny, tiny script, millimeter large or big only, as a process of writing. He did this as a daily activity and wrote on scraps of paper and so on. Nobody knew whether there was content or whether he was in essence going through the process of writing without developing content. It was unknown. And at his death, his guardian tried to preserve the work. He wanted it to be destroyed, and luckily it didn't happen. And many years later, it took two literary historians 18 years to decipher those texts, and they could establish that in fact there was content to those brief texts. And I was very interested in that circumstance, that it was not clear what his thinking was at the time in terms of what would happen to the work. Mm-hmm. And clearly he did not need an audience. In his mind, the writing process as a very private activity was more relevant. In fact, he was a bit of a recluse, hence the text at the bottom, how dare you talk to me as if you knew me, which again resonated with me. This is a direct quote. And I became very interested in the whole idea of the microscripts. They're very beautiful. And ironically enough, of course, I enlarged the microscript to this size, which is, very different, of course, from seeing the originals. And I'm calling this work in terms, of not the cycle, but the subtitle to this particular work within the reception theory overall umbrella construct, translating the illegible. So the idea that something was not only illegible, but only partially visible, that those two things came together was very, very interesting to me. And as we just discussed with the Untitled series, there are elements also which bring forms to the threshold of the perceptible, in this case also legible, which for me allows a viewer to be much more intensely engaged in trying to decipher, of course, literally and metaphorically, the meaning of those words. Mm-hmm. So it is something that runs through quite a few of my works. In fact, I'm working on a large series now where I have erased a lot of the works on paper. So the idea again of removing them from the viewer enough that the elements of doubt, which for me philosophically is a very important construct, the question of veracity, truth, and so on, come into the discussion, into the debate. So those are some of the reasons why I felt this may be a way to frame the questions so that those issues would come up for a viewer. Well, this is also, we were talking about the role of the artist. It brings to mind also something that I was very fascinated with. Lawrence Krauss, the cosmologist and astrophysicist said once, for a physicist, for a scientist, the most relevant activity is to frame questions and to frame precise and visionary questions. And I think that is a parallel activity to what making art is all about, to frame questions, to raise questions, So I feel these tactics that I have used now in many works are part of that intent,
That's an interesting quotation. And it strikes me, in light of that, perhaps your relationship to materials follows through on that question of a critical inquiry, that the way you use materials is in fact a challenge our understanding or the conventional notion that we have of a material in reference to the ideas that they're working with.
Absolutely. I mean, usually, of course, the idea is the primary thing, but I try to find a material representation which supports that idea clearly. So in this case, this evolved as a possibility using the screening or using the process of erasure, or again, having the removal of the final and definite from sight, to withhold in a way almost, Yeah.
As one moves across this work, its materiality is both exaggerated and called into question.
Yes, yes. The viewer becomes aware of his or her movement in front of the work, which to me was also something I wanted. I wanted a viewer to be placed in a position of having to reflect back on himself or herself, and then to the work and back and forth. And the moire, of course, is an interesting way of taking advantage of that effect. Yeah.
All of this, of course, if I draw back a bit, Therese, raises another question. It's a very large question. I'm not really sure if there's any real good answer to it, but we work, as artists, we work in a larger context, context of ideas, particularly ideas as they're being understood at the moment, in the moment. And there is the sort of haunting question, what is the context in which one is operating at a given moment as an artist? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this given moment, the moment that we're working in here in the second decade of the 21st century, what kind of context we work within. In a sense, a context is also a boundary, a set of suggestions or a series of references to which we need to respond. And just as the artists of the 60s responded to certain ideas then, do you think that there's a particularity to the context in which we operate today as artists?
I think every moment has its own framework, and one that we may recognize quite readily, or one that we have difficulty identifying. And sometimes it's both, that certain things come into focus quite clearly, we can realize them and respond, acknowledge them, either by confirming, supporting, or in a critical way. Either art holds up that, what I called a model previously, that puts us in a position of having to respond, as I said, either in an affirmative or in a critical way. Of course, one of the things that has shaped the 21st century beyond our wildest expectations are the new technologies, and we cannot escape the reality that that affects our everyday life at every turn. And I think as artists, of course, we struggle with the intentions or desire to make sense out of this all. So I think it is one aspect of today's reality that is ever present, and I think every generation will find different ways of relating to it. We see it in a slightly larger time frame than, let's say, the younger generation that can inhabit that more easily. We always, have the questions attached to what it might mean, I think, with the perspective over time, that constructing meaning and trying to find out what that means is fraught with not only fears and apprehension, but also, of course, with new insights, fundamental insights. Also, of course, how we perceive the world has changed dramatically. We have, now learned so much about how in scientific research the universe is perceived as an entity that's far larger than we could have imagined. So even the position of the world in relationship to the larger entity has shifted dramatically. I think it shapes the perception of who we are now and what the meaning is of that. So I would say, those two things, our awareness of the reality of the world in the largest possible context and the new technologies would be two things I would see as shaping our perceptions fundamentally.
I was curious when I read about a particular work of yours that I hadn't come up against, Therese. And I was curious because it refers to a favorite character in my childhood, Heffalump. And I was really curious that you used that title from Winnie the Pooh, of course. And of course, it raises the question of what is it one can call it? I guess you could call it a sense of humor or a sense of the absurdly familiar that doesn't seem quite right somehow, which is one of the, I think, sponsors of a sense of humor or a sense of comedy. And I hadn't really thought of your work through that lens. Do you want to explore that a little bit?
This is a series of floor sculptures, which, as I was developing them in the studio, started to appear to me to be on the boundary between something that was animate and not so inanimate or inanimate. And I started to develop an affection for those forms. And sometimes titles are constructed on a very conscious analytical level. And this was a case where I intuitively started to think about these objects as my heffalumps. And of course I was also thinking of the Winnicott's theory of the amenable object. For me they had some such dimension. But they also had another layer, and that layer goes back to a more, or refers to a more scientific construct, and that was Jean-François Lissayou, who was a French mathematician, who developed theory of equations that in turn reflected representations of sound vibrations. And I was thinking that it was known that these equations of sound vibrations would tend to, if they were visualized, form knots. And I thought that was a very beautiful metaphor. I was also thinking of these sculptures with the subtitle of touching sound, because they were very tactile, which was what fed into the heffalump title. But I wanted those two things to come together, that there was a very tactile quality to the pieces, and at the same time that I would acknowledge that at the core of this development of those forms were Lissayou's equations, which were very, very beautiful forms ultimately, and that they represented sound, which of course is invisible, but I was thinking of a sound that is touchable. In other words, that the senses would come together. But the heffalumps for me seemed a very also poetic way of constructing, the title, and so it was a kind of a fusion of those strands that I tried to bring together. Yeah.
Well, thinking of Winnie the Pooh, does literature play a part in your thinking? We've talked about theory, theorists, and I just wonder, turning to literature, not necessarily Winnie the Pooh, of course, does literature play a part in the development of the work?
Precisely in the way as the Heffalumps do. In other words, in an indirect way. And it's not that literary works are necessarily the basis for pieces, but they have certainly informed my thinking on many occasions. There's a work, also a screening work with the title Simultan, and that is informed by Ingeborg Bachmann's novel by the same title. But that is in turn paired with constructs of time. It consisted of many small elements, each of which was the carrier of one word, and each of these words represented a construct of time. And I was particularly interested in the construct of simultaneity in opposition to, let's say, linear constructs or cyclical constructs and so on. I tried to juxtapose all these ways that we give a form, a shape to time. And I continue to be particularly interested in the notion of simultaneity because, of course, it is something that is affecting us very intensely in this, moment in time, moment in history. And so literary elements or literary sources may come into play in a very subtle way, but not as the central construct of a work. But I've always read, for instance, when I was living in Mexico, I was most interested in some of the literary figures, in that case, Octavio Paz and Carlos Fuentes, because they're two authors who spoke eloquently about Mexican identity and Mexican history in the most developed, thoughtful, complex way. So it certainly affected my thinking, my awareness of an entire culture, my awareness of how it had affected my work. So in that sense, yes, but not in the sense that I took, this piece of writing as the text that informed the work in its entirety, usually as maybe one layer or one element in a larger set of considerations.
Interesting. I'm interested how aware you are of other voices in the world, if you can put it that way. And turning that around, Therese, is there a particular way in which you hope or expect a larger audience to relate to your own work? Do you have any expectation about that? Or anticipation?
Well, I think this is a very difficult question because it can mean so many different things. And I think the way art is being received, it brings us back to the whole issue of reception, yet again, has been changing so dramatically. So clearly the expectation I had when I was a younger artist was different from what it was 10 years later, 20 years later, and now I feel I know less than ever what that may mean. Because of course, with the new media, the dissemination of images, all the parameters that we have gotten used to have been removed. So I find it's extremely complex to think about that. And of course, we have two options. One is to try and control to some extent how we would like that process to take shape. And on the other hand, to think we absolutely cannot control it. So the only options we have is to let it happen, you know. And of course, where we present the work is primary, you know, what do we choose as a strategy to either, you know, address the largest possible audience or to address a very narrow audience that's highly knowledgeable and clearly defined, and then many, many shades in between. And of course, I mean, I make a huge distinction between the public and an audience. When I think of an audience, I think of a group of individuals who are already interested in the activity in principle, and an audience that may be specialized or highly specialized is possible. But if we think of the internet, of course, there are no boundaries whatsoever. It can mean anything, and yet we can also, through the internet, try to address a specific audience. I mean, now the expectation is for everyone to have a website. It's like a role a gallery used to play in some ways, you know. So I think the options have changed completely, and I think we are all trying to find ways that suits our previous history, so there's a sense of continuation and consistency and integrity, or, you know, we just let go and allow things to happen and chance to play a much larger role. I have never felt that I wanted the largest possible audience. It was never my goal. I mean, the opposite. I've tended to perhaps withdraw a bit and address myself to a known circle within a community. And of course, a community in turn can be defined as a small, we can think of Toronto, let's say, or we can think of Canada in a national context or an international context or globally. I mean, all of these things exist. They can overlap, of course. I think it's a very difficult question. My expectations are less clear now to me than they were, let's say, 20 years ago, you know, where I thought there were certain structures that I highly valued, that I appreciated clearly, that it was an audience that I could somehow feel, see, read, sense that it was present. And now I know less where the boundaries are, what it means, you know, who may be looking at the work.
I want to turn to another way of looking, and that is the student-teacher relationship. And you've taught for many years, and you're very well known and respected as a teacher as well as, of course, as an artist. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about your role as a teacher, the role of the student with respect to yourself, and how you felt that benefited, of course, a new generation of emerging artists, and also how perhaps you benefited from it as well.
I have taught through my entire career. I have found it to be extremely stimulating and enjoyable most of the time. I have enjoyed the fact that this teaching is a process which allows us to articulate and define ideas in a process of exchange, ongoing exchange. We come back to the relevance of ideas and dealing with ideas. Of course, it's an ideal environment within which to practice that, the testing, honing, articulating and re-articulating of ideas in an ongoing way. And the students, of course, are fantastic in their approach because they are in the process of defining for themselves what it means to clarify certain ideas or a basis from which to produce their own work. And there's also an expectation with most students that they are living in a moment of change, of flux, that things are being re-articulated anew by their generation, their environment, their moment and awareness of a specific moment in time. And I very much enjoyed that level of uncertainty, that perhaps things are not the way we assumed they were, but we can try and find a completely new way of defining a thought, an idea, a philosophical, a theoretical construct. And to be part of that seemed like a privilege to me, to be able to be there. And of course, it requires an element of trust to say honestly what one thinks or doubts or perceives to be perhaps a possibility, to speculate and to keep that process alive. I mean, there has to be a sense of dynamism, you know, that again, I enjoyed tremendously with the students, you know. So that ongoing process and searching was for me at the center of the whole teaching experience.
What about the role of the critic? I'm kind of curious. The question of criticism comes up time and again, of course, historically as well as currently, but particularly in this moment, there seems to be a question around the role of the critic and what critical reception actually constitutes. In your own experience, Therese, have you formulated any thoughts over the years about the nature of critical response and the kind of criticism that seems to be most effective?
Again, I think it is connected to the whole process of reception of artworks. Mm-hmm. The critic, of course, has a particular role. The critic is not the larger audience. The critic is an informed individual. We expect a highly informed individual who looks at work probably already with an extensive history of looking at works, perhaps looking at similar works, looking at radically different works. And of course, looking at works again at the certain moment in time. And I think there are many forms of criticism, each of which can be valuable for a certain circumstance. Of course, it can be an art historical lens that guides the analysis of a work, which is highly valuable. Or it can be a criticism from a particular theoretical position or ideological position, from a cultural context, and so on. And in each case, it can mean something different. I think what is crucial, most relevant in my mind, is the complexity of thinking. If the work even is highly critical, but it is written and approached with a high level of complexity, it can be extremely valuable. And the other component I see as relevant, and I see that as parallel to art production, that good work has to have a level of honesty. It cannot be strategic or propaganda or serve a propaganda agenda, but it has to be honest from the perspective of what that individual who writes knows and represents in relationship to that position. And I think, to me, it's absolutely parallel to making artwork. If an artwork is strictly strategic, for me it doesn't have a real value. And I think in criticism it's similar. And of course it can mean that it represents a particular ideological or theoretical or art historical position, but it has to come from a perspective of conviction and commitment, an honest commitment to those ideas, and a willingness to question some of those ideas at the same time also, not to become dogmatic or that a position is overly fixed. That I find problematic. So there has to be a personal questioning and a questioning of the work in in the writing, you know.
As you spoke about that, I couldn't help thinking, and this has becoming very, you might say, specific and personal to the moment. But John Bentley Mays passed away just recently, and while many artists felt indignant, perhaps sometimes, about the things that John Bentley Mays wrote, in retrospect, he's taken on an aura of this honesty that you're describing. Do you have any thoughts about John Bentley Mays at the time he was writing?
Well, I think he was a relevant figure, you know, and it's painful to put that in the past in such a way. But I do think in most cases he did write what he thought. Mm-hmm. And of course that also made for enemies or resistance. To me, that is not a bad thing, the opposite. I think if the work is always within a certain range and doesn't dare to step out of what is expected, or perhaps is even a surprise to the critic or writer himself or herself, that perhaps I never thought I would perceive it that way, but that's allowed to become visible. It is like breaking a surface of security that allows us to glimpse through some perhaps more complex and deeper issues, can be a good thing. Of course it takes away what is predictable. It also removes the statements from a market kind of a situation, because if the strategy is to promote the work strictly without other dimensions, then I think it's problematic. There have to be reasons why somebody feels this is work that needs to be acknowledged, and that goes beyond the most immediate. So John Mays dared, of course, sometimes to make himself unpopular, and I think perhaps it came as a surprise to him also what the vehement response might have been at certain moments, you know. But we need more writers, we need more critics, we need different voices, we need different positions, we need different generational representation. We need all of those voices, and they're not enough, I feel. So I see that as an issue in this community.
I think I'll turn to the notion of the collector. Just thinking of what you were saying about this question of the personal and the honest in connection with criticism and in connection with art as well. Would you see the collector through that lens as well? What would be your notion of the admirable collector, let's say, Therese?
Well, I think collecting is an activity that's close also to the reception of artworks. We keep coming back to that topic. It is everything that happens between the production of the work and how it enters the larger world. Anything that is part of that process, and of course collecting is another one. I think an excellent collector is somebody who has established criteria over a period of time. I think it takes time to formulate criteria based on which he or she develops a collection. It is somebody who can recognize in artists' work some of the concerns, some of the ideas a society is dealing with, and he feels an artist can articulate and discuss these ideas, and by bringing these works together into a specific relationship, a collector really participates in a discourse. I think the best collections have a responsibility to an audience, to a public. And of course, an individual can have a collection that's more idiosyncratic than, let's say, a collection established by an institution, a museum, where there is usually a group of people who make a decision together, which may to some extent also represent the ideas, goals and aspirations of that institution. An individual is freed from those constraints and can take greater risks perhaps, could also be more impulsive, very likely, could change course more easily. And I think a good collection is alive. It has a certain level of urgency. I think if it isn't alive and doesn't participate in a dialogue, it loses its meaning. So I think that's ultimately its greatest danger, to lose that clarity, that intensity. And again, of course, criteria are established according to all kinds of guidelines, but they are what guides the collection, and they emerge slowly. I think it takes time. And I think there are many different forms of collecting, but to me, this is what an ideal collector would do, have a true commitment to the work, and very likely be engaged in a dialogue with participants in an art community of different forms, maybe, with curators, obviously with artists, with writers, and so on, a range of figures.
One last question. Circulating around a practice, and I think for a collector such as you're describing, something that would resonate, I think, with a collector especially, but with curators and, of course, the extended world of critics and such, circulating around this process, let's call it, there is this haunting question: how can I understand what is real? How can I understand what is, you might say, authentic in the circumstance that I'm examining? Whether it's the artist looking at their own practice and pushing it forward, whether it's a critic or a curator or a collector attempting to assemble their relationship to the artist. Do you have any thoughts about what would constitute this notion, this very vague notion of authenticity or what is real? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think criteria of any form are established through comparison. And being able to look at artworks would require intensive looking at many examples of certain types of work, and by comparing, once certain criteria are established, finding the best examples and then trying to look at those very carefully. And it would have to seem that those examples are distinct and are better able to articulate certain ideas than others. So I think it's, again, the precision by which ideas are articulated, the clarity, the precision, the thoughtfulness, the uniqueness, and of course, when I bring into the whole discussion the notion of honesty, it would be that honesty that makes the work distinct, that in that no other individual could be thinking exactly the same thoughts. That's when we think, of course, of a copy, that it is echoing something that is already established. So it would again bring into the discourse something that has previously been unknown, but has been developed with a knowledge that recognizes things which perhaps were precursors, relatives in terms of the constructs, or nuanced rearticulation. So it brings us back to what we talked about earlier, that the process of making art is combining what is known and what is unknown. If it is completely known, it becomes a copy because everything has already been established. And the unknown element within something that's known with great depth and complexity makes for a unique, new articulation, you know.